Were you an administrator there, or were you an instructor in a specific subject?
No, I was the chief investigation instructor.
And what subjects did you particularly specialise in?
I particularly specialised in electrical fires, fires in dwellings, and industrial fires.
And do you have a special interest in the combustion qualities of different materials?
Part of my duty is to have an interest in the combustion qualities of all materials.
Yes, both as to the temperature at which they tend to combust and at the speed at which they burn?
Yes, and indeed what was left after they burn.
And you'd regard yourself as an expert on those subjects, I take it?
Oh, yes.
Now, what is the temperature at which a typical woolen blanket will begin to smoulder?
220 degrees centigrade.
And what is the temperature at which it will burst into flame?
250 degrees centigrade.
Yes. And what about a bed? Now, did you assume in this case that it was a metal bed or a wooden bed, or did you not have any assumptions on that?
I assumed that it was not a metal bed.
Yes. It had a wire base?
Not necessarily.
Yeah, but if it had a wire base, what would be the temperature at which that would have disintegrated?
It would depend then on the material which constituted the wire base. There are different materials used.
Yes.
Some would have could well have been consumed in the fire, and some might not. I assumed, obviously, that it was of the former.
Yes. Now, if I understand it's your theory as to this fire that it was started by an electric blanket, is that correct?
Well, that's a possible cause.
Yes. Now, if an electric blanket had generated an electrical fault which had led to combustion, not be the usual thing that after a relatively short time the electricity would fuse and the power would be withdrawn from that situation?
That might well happen.
Yes, and you would be left then with wool and cotton and things of that nature which are relatively slow burning, are they not?
Well, not once they get underway, no.
And are you seriously suggesting that a fire in a bed started in that way could generate so much heat that every trace of that bed and its bedding would disappear down a neat 7'5" hole, but leave the rest of the bedroom charred but relatively intact? Is that what your theory is?
That has been, well, it's not my theory. That is, as I understand it, was the finding made by the investigation officers who attended the scene, and it's certainly consistent with my experience in thousands of such fires.
You've seen thousands of fires where a bed has just disappeared, as it were, leaving no trace.
Yes, in my 30 years in this area.
Can you give us one example where this has happened, where you actually...
Well, the last one, in fact, was one in which I investigated only 2 weeks ago in the next suburb at 35 Brown Street. And precisely the same thing had happened.
And did you have some reason for assuming that the bed had done this disappearing trick rather than that it had been removed before the fire?
Well, there was no other explanation for the seat of the fire, particularly a seat of fire that large in that position in a bedroom. I suppose it's possible there was some other object of similar size and composition to a bed, but one really looks for the more likely explanation.
Well, now, if we can move on, you gave some thought to the evidence of Mr. Perth, who had reported splash marks. Now, you have come to the view, have you not, that that is not really an indication that the fire started in any particular way, that the fire may have simply progressed from the bed to the rest of the house?
Yes, that seems to me to be a consistent cause.
Yes. Now, if that theory were being examined in opposition to Mr. Perth's theory, one would have to look very carefully, would one not, at the evidence that remained behind to see whether it was more consistent with one theory or the other.
The fact of the spread marks is the important thing. I don't, by inspection, whether one cause would be more or less likely than the other.
Well, let us put it this way. If this fire had started in the bed and gradually progressed to the centre of the house and then to the rear of the house, would you not expect that there would be general burning of the walls rather than any particular pattern of burning?
Well, as I understand it, there's no evidence that there was a gradual progression. I understand in this dwelling there were no eaves, and it's likely, therefore, that the progression of the fire was very rapid.
Well, we'll come back to that, but if the real event was that the fire started in the bed and gradually moved to the rest of the house, where it came upon, as it were, combustible material in the hallway and the family room, and that material had exploded, would you not expect a particular pattern of fire marks around the scene of the explosion?
Well, if you make the assumption that the fire moved gradually from one point to another, you would expect to find probably a different pattern of burning from that where there had been a rapid movement of the fire.
Yes, and if, for example, it was an explosion with the fire gradually reaching, let us say, the flammable material in the hallway, which then exploded, you would expect, would you not, that there would be a general wide fire mark around that area, spread more or less at random?
Not with mineral turpentine. With turpentine, I would expect there to be the spread marks in a wide area, yes, certainly consistent with those reported by Mr. Pert.
They wouldn't, if it was an explosion, with the origin being that the fire came to the turpentine rather than the turpentine created the fire, you would expect it to be, the fire marks to be distributed randomly around the site of the turpentine, would you not?
Well, the spread marks as described in Mr. Pert's report are consistent.
That's not the question I asked. You would
I'm sorry, what was the
not,
question?
You'd expect, would you not, that if there was a fire which led to turpentine exploding, that there would be a generalised burning around the area of the turpentine rather than a particular pattern of burning?
I don't understand your question.
Well, if the turpentine had exploded, it would have exploded in all directions, would it not?
Most probably, depending, of course, on the nature of the container.
And if the fire had then progressed to the family room at the rear of the house, you would expect equally, would you not, that there would be a generalised surrounding area that would be showing signs of burns rather than a particular specific spread of burns?
I don't really understand your question.
Right. Well, let us take two theories then. One is that the fire gradually spread to points of burning material, and that in two particular points near the kitchen and near the family room, that material flared up, as it were. You would expect, would you not, that there would be generalised burning in those areas?
Well, if you adopted that theory, I should say I don't, and nor did Mr. Pert.
But if, on the other hand, these spots were the sources of the fire, and some person had deliberately lit this fire, it would be consistent with that, would there not, that there would be a narrow pattern of flammable material running from one igniting point to the next?
Well, if you assume that somebody had deliberately lit the fire by carrying flammable material from one point to another, then you would certainly expect to find those sort of results, yes.
And if an experienced fire, if an experienced fire investigator such as you or Mr. Pert was seeking to demonstrate or establish which of those possible origins was more likely, the way to do so, would it not, would be to look at such evidence as remained and see whether it was more consistent with one form of origin or another.
Well, one needs to know the findings and make a conclusion as to
And
what sort of cause they're consistent with. I'd agree with that.
And you didn't bother to go to the scene of the fire and make your own judgment as to whether the evidence, such as it was, pointed in one direction or the other.
Well, it's not a matter of not bothering. I was consulted well after the fire had occurred. There was no point in returning to the scene the time at which I was consulted.
And Mr. Pert was one of your students. I take it you trained him well?
Yes, he was quite a good student, although I always found him a little ambitious.
He worked in the fire brigade for nearly 20 years, did he not? He rose.
Yes, it was unfortunate he never really progressed beyond that.
Yes. But if Mr. Pert reported that there was a narrow pattern of intense burning running along the walls and floor of a moderate-sized house between 3 points of conflagration, would you not agree that it would be more likely than not that that had happened as a result of something being done to link those points rather than that the fire progressed naturally?
No, the opinion I have expressed is based on the findings as recorded in his report.
Well, do you agree that his report describes a path of relatively intensive burning moving from the front of the house to the position in the hallway and to the position in the family room where there's intense burning, and that it is a relatively, as described, it's a relatively narrow pattern of intense burning linking these 3 points?
No, I don't agree with that.
But you didn't see it and Mr. Pert did.
No, I don't agree with the proposition you just put. He reported splash marks between the various seats of fire. That's all.
Yes. Now, you based your conclusions to some extent on what you were told by Mrs. Sun, didn't you?
Mrs. Sun?
Yes, was that right? About what was stored in the kitchen?
Yeah, in the hallway, I think.
No, but you said in your report, did you not, it was in the hallway area of the kitchen?
No, Mrs. Sun told me about the electric blanket.
Yes, but can we keep...
And she also told me about the mineral turpentine in the hallway.
But did you not make a report in which you recorded that she told you it was in the hallway area of the kitchen?
That's right.
And what did you mean by the hallway area of the kitchen?
Well, the kitchen end of the hallway.
But that's not what you said, is it?
That's what I meant.
Well, you said in the area of the kitchen.
In the hallway area of the kitchen.
Did you have any real knowledge of where this turpentine had been located? In the light of that vague report.
I prepared a map of the house and
yes.
indicated on it the seats of fire.
Yes. Was there a door blocking the passageway from the hallway to the family room?
On the map?
No, in fact. What did you assume as a fact?
I assumed that there were doorways as shown on the map which I prepared.
But was there a permanently closed door?
I made no assumptions as to whether any door was permanently closed.
And you didn't make any inspection to see whether that was likely to have been the case or not to have been?
Well, the house had been burnt down by the time I...
But there was sufficient evidence for other fire investigators to examine the position, was there not, and to come to conclusions on the basis of what marks remained?
There was no reference in Mr. Pert's report to there being any door.
No, but you didn't think it was sufficiently important to go and compare what they had reported with what you could see?
Well, I was told the house had been bulldozed by the time I was brought into it.
Well, in that event...
So I relied on
yes.
what was set out in Mr. Pert's report and, of course, that of Mr. Officer.
And you'd agree, would you not, that you were not really in a position to bring your own expertise to bear on this situation when the evidence had been substantially eliminated before you could look at it?
I was bringing my expertise to bear on the matters reported by Mr. Pert.